Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.
Welcome to Liberty with Love with Robin Koerner. It is an honor to have you all out there taking an hour out of your week to listen to anything I might have to say, or indeed, in some cases, what my guests have to say, of course. If you didn't get to hear last week's show, check out my interview with Glenn Morgan, one of my favorite activists. That show, like all of my shows, are archived at libertytalk.fm. And you can also find YouTube versions on my own channel. If you do a search on Robin Koerner, Art of Political Persuasion, you'll also find a bunch of content there. So yes, well, you know, I don't want to be too obvious, but it's kind of hard to do a political radio show and not have anything to say about our new leader. You know, one of my friends got upset with me because I called him President Trumpet in a couple of posts on Facebook a few weeks ago. And I actually thought that wasn't insulting at all. I actually thought it was kind of, I don't want to say cleverly descriptive, but certainly apt. I mean, if there's one characteristic that could fairly be attributed to President Donald Trump, I think it is rather that he trumpets himself, his views, his ideas, whether we like them or not. It just seems so perfect to me. And, but you know, this friend objected a little, thought that I was kind of being insulting. And any of the people that follow my work, either on, say, my Facebook group or the Blue Republican Facebook group or through any of my channels, know that I don't go in for personal digs. And I certainly didn't mean that to be one. As I say, I think it was a fair description of what a shorthand of the way we've seen Donald Trump govern. And actually, for a leader, trumpeting something i.e. saying something in a certain way, can actually have a substantial political effect. And I think it is fair to say that is so in the case of Donald Trump. And maybe he is better than most people at understanding how to, you know, cause that, how to say something in a certain way to get a certain reaction. I'm still trying to work out whether he's this kind of bumbling, anti-intellectual, kind of inconsistent and therefore not really trustable person, or if he's actually a kind of more of a strategic genius who, although he can't articulate his knowledge, maybe his psychological genius, he can nevertheless act on it. And one thing that does occur to me is, you know, based on the evidence, I mean, you know, he's topped out economically with his businesses, right? One of the richest people in the United States. And now he's topped out politically. He is the ultimate alpha male. You know, and from everything we know about his personality, that kind of fits too, right? So I'm fascinated by Trump. I've got to say, I was much closer to writing him off in many ways before he became president than I am now. There seems to be some interesting analysis to be done here. And I probably should admit that I remember saying, you know, as the debates were going on between Trump and Clinton, and maybe even some of the other debates with Trump and his Republican opponents, that I just could hardly bear them because they were so boring. And they were boring because they were kind of just facile. I just, you know, was listening to Trump and I just didn't hear anything that I could really get my teeth into that I thought was kind of clever or insightful or any of that stuff. But, you know, I will throw my hands up in the air and admit, again, he's getting stuff done, and he's getting stuff done interestingly. Can I say that? He's getting stuff done interestingly. I mean, he's engaging the country, right? You know, I remember those Ron Paul cured my apathy signs, you know, years ago. And that slogan has come back to me as I watch the left go apoplectic about Trump. Trump's cured the apathy of some folks on the left. Maybe, obviously, he cured the apathy, if that's the right word, and I'm not sure it is, but, for the sake of the slogan, of those maybe more on the right who identify more conservative who voted for him. Of course, that's not to forget that he won the presidency on the back of a lot of blue-collar folks who wouldn't even call themselves conservative, right? So, obviously, the whole thing is fascinating, interesting times. And, the inauguration speech, I listened to that, and it was extraordinary. It was extraordinary. It was, it's not quite fair to say a volley of insults at the people sitting behind him. But if they weren't insults, they were very clear comments that clearly landed on the laps of the people behind him. And his language was, as it always was through the campaign, quite intemperate, right? To say something like, the carnage stops here. Extraordinary. Again, implicitly, these folks behind him on that stage in DC had caused carnage, were responsible for carnage. But of course, to the extent that folks agreed with him, he got the votes that put him right on that stage in the office of president with the authority to say that to them right then. We all love authenticity, and people voted for Trump for that reason. Many did. And he's come through on it. It's weird that this is a strange kind of honesty in and of itself, right? Because I wasn't sold on his authenticity at the time. When everybody was saying, we want to vote Trump because he tells it like he sees it, I didn't see much value in telling it like you see it if what you say that you see is the first thing that comes into your head and is quite inconsistent with what you might have said the week before, is in some cases just kind of crass, ill-informed, all these things that I certainly heard on the campaign trail from Trump. But of course, not being able to see a consistency in what he had to say, certainly a thread in what he had to say, doesn't mean that even though I can't work out that consistency, that he didn't mean whatever it was he did say and wasn't prepared to act on, and indeed has acted on a lot of what he did say, in a way that I think it's just fair to say so much of the country has been hungry for. But to that speech, the inauguration speech, I did wince. And, in a way it was just obviously Trump. There was nothing there that really reassured me as a lover of liberty, as a constitutionalist. But there was one phrase, and it was the most positive phrase in the speech. And I don't know whether I believe he meant it in the way that he said it. I don't know if it's how he experiences himself. But the phrase that he used, that I'm talking about, that resonated with me, is this: when you open your heart to patriotism, there is no room for prejudice. And that line seemed to be worth meditating on, pulled completely out of the context from the speech, for this reason, that a lot of the people who support Trump experience themselves as patriots. And most of those who oppose him viscerally do so because they say he is prejudiced, whether, that is racial prejudice, sexual prejudice, gender prejudice, etc., etc. And this battle of the banners, if I can call it that, patriotism on the one hand and the accusation of prejudice on the other, is kind of, almost symbolic of the struggles that we're now seeing in the country. Literally on the streets, at the airports, right? When people protest what Trump represents and what he's doing. I wasn't going to talk about this in this show, But I've decided to because recently I have been reading some George Orwell. And that's interesting because George Orwell is now, his book 1984 is now having a massive sales spurt, right? As people are trying to maybe understand Donald Trump, maybe they're getting scared of this fascism that others claim that Donald Trump is bringing into America. 1984 is getting a lot of sales. And George Orwell, obviously, most people know he was a socialist, but he was also an anti-totalitarian who himself worked out, even from his socialist position, that the communists had more in common with the fascists than with the kind of socialism that he wanted to see, that he believed he was advocating for. And I see we're going into the first break, so we'll be back in a few minutes. This is Liberty with Love. Welcome back. This is Robin Koerner with Liberty with Love. So I mentioned in the first segment that there was a particular line in the inauguration speech about prejudice and patriotism. Specifically, Donald Trump said, when you open your heart to patriotism, there is no room for prejudice. And then I kind of mentioned at the end of the segment George Orwell. And I want to bring, I'm going to tie those two things up. But to do that, what I need to do is go back to the article that I actually wrote recently, inspired by that line of Donald Trump's. And I entitled I titled the article "Trump's Inauguration: Patriotism Without Prejudice." It was published elsewhere. It was published. That was the Huffington Post title. It was published by Fee under the title "Patriotism Does Not Mean Prejudice," which maybe is more descriptive of the point I was making. So let me just tell you what I had to say in that article. I wrote that for me, the inauguration of President Trump was particularly poignant, as the outgoing president, Obama, was the one under whom I became a citizen, while the new president was elected in the first election in which I was also able to participate as a new American. Born British, I moved to the USA when I was 29, and in 2009 I became a permanent resident. And last year, after a 12-year Kafkaesque odyssey, I became a citizen. And in my heart and soul, though, I was American a long time before that, a fact of which I became conscious in two experiential flashes. The first made me realize that I was no longer just a Brit, and the second made me realize that I was actually spiritually an American, even though I didn't have the passport to prove it. The first occurred in Phoenix. I was in the city with a friend when we heard of a liberty-orientated political conference that was being held in the Sheraton Hotel there. Being political types, we quietly went down there and let ourselves into the back of the hall. Scanning what at the time was for me a rather unusual environment, I noticed a participant who was prominently sporting a sidearm. I was only 5 years out of Britain at the time, and the instinctive reaction of most Brits, in whose country even the police don't carry guns, to such a thing would typically be some combination of horror, perplexity, and even derision. At the very least, the sense of cultural dissonance would be instinctive. But for me, somewhat surprisingly, that wasn't the case. Even though I had never shot a handgun nor had any interest in firearms, not only did I feel at ease with that man's carrying his weapon in an indoor environment in which he was not threatened, but much more than that, I understood why he was doing it. And that the reasons were, of course, decidedly American. The idea that rights unasserted are lost over time and that a lethal means of self-defense is a right are alien to British culture now. So the fact that I didn't feel in that moment that the carrier of that gun was of a different species, let alone a different culture, for me was enough for me to register that my national identity was already becoming more complex, more layered, if you will. However, the moment I knew that I was American was altogether stranger. I was at the top of a mountain in Kyrgyzstan, sitting in a room in a rundown building that had been converted to a classroom for a week. I was there with others to share some of the principles of political and economic liberty, with a group of young adults whose formative years had come of age in the time of a former Soviet republic. At the time, one of my colleagues, an opera singer, was giving a class. After loosening up the extremely bright but highly skeptical students by getting them to discuss and then sing the Kyrgyz national anthem, my friend proceeded to sing the American anthem. And there I am in the front of this room, and the tears started rolling down my face. And they wouldn't stop. Now, not only have I never cried for the British anthem, I can't imagine any Englishman doing so. Yet there I was, with nowhere to hide in front of this rectangular room, crying for the anthem of a country to which I technically did not yet fully belong, but with which spiritually I resonated at a very deep level. I was taken aback by my own deep emotional response, but perhaps shouldn't have been. After all, there were many occasions in the preceding 5 years of a brutal legal immigration process when it would have been emotionally, financially, and practically much easier just to have given up. But on those occasions, I always returned to the simple fact that I already felt at home, and after all, one's feelings are the language of one's soul. In any case, on that day, on a mountaintop in Kyrgyzstan, I knew that while I was British, I was also American. A few months later, I was back in Phoenix and went to support an Italian friend as he became an American citizen. I imagined myself going through the same ceremony 4 years later with my own kith and kin in the audience. I smiled through the whole thing, sharing fellow feeling with all of the new citizens, not just as Americans, but as people who had overcome similar stresses and uncertainties to achieve their goal of becoming once and for all American. Yet one part of the ceremony gave me serious pause. The oath taken by new citizens includes these words: I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen. Now, imagining my mother in the audience, my stomach knotted at how upset she'd be if I renounced where I had come from and the land with which she shall always identify. I was sufficiently perturbed by the implications of that renunciation that I started Googling when I returned home to see what it actually meant. Now, in telling this story in the article, the next section was entitled Becoming a Bipatriot. And in it I said this: I have no reservation in my commitment to the USA. In fact, I have already done more to support and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States of America, quote, than many born and bred Americans, and I love doing it because I believe deeply in the founding principles of the United States and the American project. I would take up arms for the USA, and I would fight as hard to defend my fellow Americans as I would have for my fellow Brits. Indeed, to me, my British to American narrative is a rather special one, in that it follows America's historical narrative, and to me, much of what is best about the American character and foundation is an evolution, perhaps even a higher expression, of British values and political traditions. In his poem, England and America in 1782, Tennyson explains it better than I can. Google that poem. Indeed, my pride in those British gifts underpins my pride in the Americans who fought the Revolution and wrote the Constitution to save and improve on those same gifts as they were being trampled in the motherland. Britain formed me. America is what I have chosen to do with how I am formed. Renouncing one for the other would be like renouncing being a son to become a husband, or like renouncing my first child when my second is born. Doing either would be absurd and false. As with two sons, so with two countries. I love both, delight in the success of both, and pain by the falling short of both, and get to celebrate the fact that love is not diluted when it is doubled. For those reasons and others, I was glad to learn that my renunciation of Britain in the US carries no weight in Britain, and that even in American law, I can be both American and British. Thank God for that. I've embraced America fully and commit to my new countrymen. But if I really had to choose between an American identity and a British identity, I'd be overwhelmed by the unreality of that choice. So I am a bipatriot, if I might coin a term, and it's a wonderful thing to be. Just as people who can think in different languages benefit from a certain intellectual and emotional abundance, so do we bipatriots. We have an enriched identity, a more colourful sense of self. We get to see issues, especially political, philosophical and cultural, in very different ways, but in each of those ways, clearly. Not only is that exciting, it hopefully gives us something different to contribute to our adoptive country. In my case, the United States. Happily, another British-born America-phile inadvertently helped me understand why bipatriotism makes sense. Daniel Hannan, a British member of the European Parliament, and a man that I have huge respect for, said, "Patriotism is what makes people behave unselfishly. It's the basis of our sense of obligation to those around us. A patriot doesn't belittle other countries. He cheers their sense of national pride and values their freedom. Indeed, and I am blessed, like the parent of 2 children, to have twice the pride. But the skeptical reader might still ask, whom would I support in a World Cup soccer final between the US and the UK, choosing soccer only because it's one of the few team sports that are seriously played by both nations, as the answer to that question would no doubt cut to my deepest allegiance. Upon introspection, I'm delighted to find that in that game, my team never loses. The last section of the article that I wrote is called this, and this is the real point I want to make. Prejudice against patriotism is as damaging as patriotism with prejudice. In 2011, Robin Koerner wrote the article that launched the biggest coalition for Ron Paul's presidential run, called Blue Republican. Now, Stairway Press is pleased to announce the publication of his first book, If You Can Keep It, Why We Nearly Lost It and How We Get It Back. Jeffrey Tucker, who wrote the foreword, says brilliant ideas come in effervescent packages. This is a good description of Robin Koerner's provocative work. It's a work of stunning erudition and sincerity. I also happen to agree with it. I've been struggling toward a similar thesis for a good part of my writing career, though I'm certain Robin has gone beyond even my most mature thought. His section on liberty as a realization of a civilization of love truly sweeps me away with its insight and depth. I know that time is short and that people don't read as carefully as they should, but this section deserves close study by every advocate of liberty. It will change the way you think and speak about the topic. We need this book now. Pre-order your personally signed copy of If You Can Keep It at ifyoucankeepit.us. We went into the break with the beginning of the last part of the article that I wrote about patriotism and prejudice. And the point that we ended up at was this. The point of my article being prejudice against patriotism is as damaging as patriotism with prejudice. And this was the part of the article where I brought my story back round to that inauguration speech. And I said this. I didn't vote for the president who was sworn in last month. And I was not expecting to be taken by his speech, but I was struck by that one line that I've already mentioned. When you open your heart to patriotism, there is no room for prejudice. That made me recall the Hannon quote above, and it is the kind of patriotism of which my patriotism is made. It is also the patriotism of individual liberty on which our nation, my new home, was founded. The patriotism of individual liberty is the patriotism without prejudice. I hope it also is the patriotism of our new president and of those who have supported him. Our future depends heavily on it. But just as importantly, I hope that those who have justified their opposition to our new president as a way of expressing, so they say, their lack of prejudice. And there's a lot of virtue signaling in what we're seeing against Trump. I hope that those people will extend their lack of prejudice to those who are inspired by country, by its history, and its founding ideals, and so call themselves patriots. Because our future depends heavily on that too. It is sad to me that those who experience themselves as being against prejudice seem in many instances to exhibit a prejudice, obviously against diversity of opinion in many cases, in general, but quite specifically against those who would self-identify as patriots, as caring about country because it's their country, about the country's history because it's their history and its founding ideals. Maybe because they're wonderful founding ideals, and maybe because they're the founding ideals of their country. That is okay. It's okay, just as Hannon explains it's okay. And you know what? I was thinking, I feel that patriotism. I feel that patriotism for America so deeply. Is that irrational? The fact that there is sentiment in that, does that make it bad? You know, should my enlightenment self, should that part of me that went off to Cambridge to learn physics, should that rational part get rid of patriotism because I can't justify it because my patriotism towards America or Britain, as is a function of an accident of birth? No, I don't think I can explain it away, rationalize it away, or count it as having zero moral value just because it was by virtue of an accident of birth. The point is, as Dan Hannan points out, the patriotism has value, just as we can, in the sense that we are patriotic about our families. There's people who feel this patriotism. Many of us feel that our nation is a kind of extended family. And if there's nothing wrong with feeling love for family because they're your family, despite that being an accident of birth, then I see nothing wrong in patriotism per se. Because patriotism per se is not nationalism. It is not excluding. It is not a superiority complex. It is a celebration of what one is close to. It is being grateful for what's in one's life. One's country is part of one's identity. It's part of being, of one's life. I think that's a healthy thing. And Hannan says why. I'll just say what Hannan said again. His quote was, "Patriotism is what makes people behave unselfishly. It's the basis of our sense of obligation to those around us. A patriot doesn't belittle other countries. He cheers their sense of national pride and values their freedom." I certainly feel that. Obviously, Dan Hannan isn't saying that there aren't selfish patriots and there aren't bigoted patriots. Of course there are. Of course there are. But, I do a lot of traveling in Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe. And I'm excited for the people who live there, that they get to have that history, that they get to have that culture. They get to experience their architecture. It doesn't diminish what I have as an American or what I had as a Brit, right? This is, part of my experience of my love of liberty is the actual celebration of human diversity. I actually love it. I actually love intellectual diversity as well. And I think that's the lesson the left really needs to learn now, but as well. But anyway, that's what his speech triggered in me. The reason I'm bothering telling you that is so many of the left, and I hate to be so kind of cliched and general and kind of almost lazy in that labeling, but you know what I mean, right now are out there buying George Orwell and saying Trump is a fascist. Trump is a fascist. Even Slavoj Žižek, and excuse my pronunciation, the communist, he's self-identified as an old-fashioned Marxist philosopher, is going around giving speeches now in the United States saying, he's not a fascist. That has a meaning. You can't just slam the word fascist on someone who's doing things you don't like. But since a lot of our friends on the illiberal left are buying 1984 because they think they see in Donald Trump the rise of, a fascist and or totalitarian, since Orwell is, according to the number of book sales, the go-to, and since, it is fair to say, George Orwell identified on the left and identified as a socialist, and so is a reasonable go-to for folks who identify as, maybe Bernie supporters, right? Let's actually see what George Orwell actually said about patriotism and prejudice. What would George Orwell say today if he heard Trump's speech, and how would he identify in relation to it? I obviously don't know the answer to that, but I would like to read to you just a few parts of an essay that he wrote in 1940. Okay, so this is when the war is coming hard to Britain. This is the part of the Second World War where Britain stood alone, and pretty much everybody in high places except Churchill thought that, we had no chance. People were scared. The bombs were about to come, over London with the Blitz after Hitler switched from the strategic attacks on the airfields. So seeing himself as the citizen of a country that was under attack by Hitler, a country that, by the way, many people were saying should see if the deal that Hitler had formerly made Britain to leave Britain alone, if Britain would let Germany do in the East what it wanted to do, so that there would effectively be an equilibrium between the German Empire and the British Empire, the German Empire being the one that obviously the Nazis were building. In that situation, George Orwell, the socialist, and he reminds his readers that he's a socialist in this essay, says in this essay called My Country, Right or Left, once England was in a serious jam, it would be impossible for me to sabotage it. But let no one mistake the meaning of this. Patriotism has nothing to do with conservatism. It is devotion to something that is changing but is felt to be mystically the same, like the devotion of the ex-white Bolshevik to Russia. To be loyal both to Chamberlain's England and to the England of tomorrow might seem an impossibility if one did not know it to be an everyday phenomenon. Chamberlain's England and the England of tomorrow, by the way, I think, is Orwell being a socialist. He wanted a very different England from the England that the Tory Chamberlain stood for. He was fighting everything politically about Chamberlain, right? Everything that Chamberlain stood for, was, Orwell was against. But now, in this essay in 1940, Orwell says to be loyal both to Chamberlain's England and to the England of tomorrow, which for Orwell was a socialist England, might seem an impossibility if one did not know it to be an everyday phenomenon. Patriotism has nothing to do with conservatism, says Orwell. Okay. He goes on in this essay. He went to one of those schools, I should just add, where, they did kind of cadet training. Okay. So he writes in this essay, I grew up in an atmosphere tinged with militarism, and afterwards I spent 5 boring years within the sound of bugles. To this day it gives me a faint feeling of sacrilege not to stand to attention during God Save the King. That's the British national anthem, of course. That is childish, says Orwell, but I would sooner have that kind of upbringing than be like the left-wing intellectuals who are so enlightened that they cannot understand the most ordinary emotions. Isn't that a killer line? In 1940, George Orwell, the socialist, wrote a sentence that would explain how Clinton managed to lose to Donald Trump in America in 2017. I'm going to read it again. I would sooner have that kind of upbringing than be like the left-wing intellectuals who are so enlightened that they cannot understand the most ordinary emotions. In that sentence, Orwell also predicted in 1940 why the media completely wouldn't be able to see coming the fact that ordinary Britons would vote for Brexit. George Orwell goes on, it is exactly the people whose hearts have never leapt at the sight of a Union Jack, or in America, of course, the equivalent would be the Stars and Stripes. It is precisely those people who will flinch from revolution when the moment comes. Isn't that interesting? Orwell is saying that it's the people who don't feel a sense of patriotism that will flinch from his socialist revolution when the moment comes. Interesting. Because the revolution, of course, was, back then, 1940, right? Think about what their memories are of and what they knew revolution would mean. People were going to get hurt in the revolution. It wasn't about that George Orwell is talking about, this putative revolution. It wasn't going to be about, just breaking property and killing other people. It was going to be about losing one's own property and getting killed. And he thinks, George Orwell, the socialist, the internationalist, the anti-totalitarian, the anti-Nazi, says that what you need to fight for what really matters, the lack of prejudice, is a sense of patriotism. It's kind of like what I was saying, just going further. Anyway, the last sentence from the article that I want to read is this. Well, it's actually just a phrase. Orwell talks of The power of one kind of loyalty to transmute itself into another. The spiritual need for patriotism, for which, however little the boiled rabbits of the left may like them, no substitute has yet been found. Amazing, right? And I mentioned Slavoj Žižek before. And, I was listening to some of his comments on where we're at now, remembering in mind that he's a down-the-line leftist political philosopher. And he's a hero to many on the left. I mean, he's a real intellectual. He says, that there is something that it's so easy to be against prejudice in the abstract, right? To be against racism in the abstract. But that isn't the same as being not being prejudiced in one's life, in one's actions, in one's actual thoughts about other individuals. And I think we're really seeing that. It's all of these people that say they're against, prejudice in terms of the collective groups. Against discrimination, if you like, a charge that they, of course, level heavily at Trump. It's those same people that are happy to discriminate against people, individuals, just because of one thing they know about them, right? Which is might be they voted for Trump, right? It's like they don't even have to know the reasons. Now, I am not here defending Trump. That's not what I'm doing here. But I'm talking about political psychology. I'm talking about human nature. I go running in the beautiful part of Seattle where I live, one of the neighborhoods, not too far from downtown, but it's kind of up on a bluff, and I live kind of on the edge of this neighborhood where there's these $1 million houses and you've got these amazing views of the Puget Sound. So it's beautiful to go running. Anyway, I've started seeing these signs going up in the gardens in this area. And they're signs that simply say, in different languages, the equivalent of "you're welcome here." So the first language is Spanish, and then in English, everybody's welcome here. Then it's in Arabic. So obviously, if you're an immigrant, right, reading Spanish, you're welcome here. If you are a Muslim, right, because it's in Arabic, you're welcome here. It's obviously a statement against what the folks who put that up in their garden think to be a political trend represented by Trump and maybe his fascism that they don't like. I was wondering if we could not have those signs where we say also somehow in English, and if you're a Trump voter, you're welcome here, right? Because I wonder if they mean it. I wonder if I were to put that sign up, would that be embraced by the people who put those pro-immigration signs up? Would the diversity be embraced? Or would it be deemed to be like a below-the-belt attack? I just wonder. Well, my friends, we're coming to the end of the hour. I will be in DC this week for the International Students for Liberty Conference. There's a couple of really exciting things happening there for me, so I can't wait to go. First of all, I will be going in my capacity as the Director of Communications for Tax Revolution Institute. This week, we are relaunching the organization. It's something huge. It's something I've been working on extensively for the last few months with the amazing team at TRI, and especially with the Chief Executive, Daniel Johnson, who's an amazing, amazing young man who I've had on this show a couple of times. So I will be there working with Tax Revolution Institute. You can check them out at taxrevolution.us. I will also be there in my own capacity as Robin Koerner on robinkoerner.com, selling some books with a couple of great friends and colleagues of mine. But I will also be doing something very special. Jeffrey Tucker and I are going to be having on the last day of the conference, kind of like the closing event, not the official closing event, but at the very end of the conference, a discussion, a conversation. And we're having this conversation to promote a book that we will be publishing, hopefully all being well, this week, an ebook. And to give you a clue of what it's about, it's called Truth and Beauty, Frank and Friendly Conversations on Being Human. What better way to market that than to have a conversation and invite all comers? And some of you may have seen Jeffrey and my chat on anarchism versus minarchism. At Jeffrey's request, we're going to discuss that same topic at ISFLC in DC this week, in front of a live audience, whoever would like to come on that last day. We're calling it Trim the State or Burn It Down. Trim the State or Burn It Down. I have no idea how this conversation will go, but I know whenever I talk to Jeffrey, it's wonderful. I'm honored and humbled that he would want to do this with me, and I'm thrilled that we're putting this book together. This book of transcripts of conversations between Jeffrey and me. That is what it is. Isn't that awesome? Okay, well, thanks for being with me. This is Liberty with Love. I'm Robin Koerner. The archives are at libertytalk.fm. Check out robinkoerner.com. Follow me on Facebook and go to the Blue Republican group on Facebook too.
Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. libertytalk.fm.